October 23, 1955. The Sicilian sun was a white-hot hammer, beating down on the ancient limestone of Syracuse. In the paddock of the Gran Premio di Syracuse, the air was a thick, suffocating cocktail of dust, sea salt, and the oily perfume of castor-based fuel. This was the heartland of Italian motorsport, a place where racing was not a hobby, but a religion. The high priests of this religion were the works Maserati team. They had arrived with a fleet of their legendary 250Fs, machines of such exquisite beauty and speed that they were considered the gold standard of the era. Their drivers were national heroes: Luigi Musso, the dashing Roman, and Luigi Villoresi, the veteran master. For the local tifosi, the result of the race was a foregone conclusion. An Italian car would win on Italian soil. The only question was which Maserati driver would take the wreath. At the very end of the pit lane, tucked away like a shameful secret, sat two cars that looked profoundly out of place. They were painted a deep, somber green. They were tall, slightly awkward, and bore the name Connaught on their noses, a name that meant absolutely nothing to the Sicilian crowd. The Connaught team hadn't arrived in a fleet of polished transporters. They had arrived in a single, battered bus that had been converted into a makeshift carrier. On the long journey from England, the bus's brakes had caught fire while descending the Alps. The mechanics were exhausted, their overalls stained with the grime of 1,000 miles of roadside repairs. They had no spare engines, very few spare tires, and almost no money. But their greatest liability, at least according to the pundits, was the man sitting in the cockpit of the lead car. Tony Brooks was 23 years old. He wasn't a professional racer. He was a dental student at Manchester University who had taken time off from his studies to fly to Sicily. He had never driven a Formula One car before this weekend. He didn't even have a proper racing suit. He wore a pair of old trousers and a light blue polo shirt. The Italian press looked at the racing dentist and his strange green car and laughed. They saw a sacrificial lamb. They saw an amateur playing a game he didn't understand. Nobody knew it yet, but the sport of Formula One was about to be hit by a seismic shock that would rattle the foundations of Maranello and Modena. The era of Italian absolute dominance was about to end. Not at the hands of a giant corporation, but because of a broke team from a Surrey garage and a student who had spent the previous week studying anatomy. By the time the sun set over Syracuse, the world would know that the British were coming. The story of the Connaught Type B is a story of defiance. It began in a tiny garage in Send, Surrey, under the leadership of Rodney Clark and Mike Oliver. Connaught, short for Continental Autos, was a boutique operation. They were what the great Enzo Ferrari would later dismissively call garagistes. They didn't have the backing of the Italian state or the industrial might of Mercedes-Benz. They had a drawing board, a few lathes, and a stubborn belief that British engineering could beat the world. The Type B was their masterpiece, but it was a masterpiece born of compromise. Because they couldn't afford a bespoke engine, they used a 4-cylinder block designed by Alta. To make it competitive against the V12s and straight-8s of Europe, they equipped it with an advanced fuel injection system, a technology that was notoriously temperamental and prone to catastrophic failure. The car was a technical gamble. It featured a pre-selector gearbox that required the driver to choose a gear before they actually needed it, then flick a lever to engage it. It was a complex, counterintuitive system that required a calm, analytical mind to operate at 150 miles per hour. The team was so broke that when they were invited to the Syracuse Grand Prix, they almost couldn't afford the fuel to get there. The organizers had offered starting money, a flat fee just to show up, which was the only reason the battered bus had left Surrey in the first place. This wasn't a quest for glory. It was a desperate attempt to keep the bailiffs from the door. When Tony Brooks arrived in Sicily, He faced a problem that would have broken a lesser man. Because he had been delayed by his university exams, he had missed the first day of practice. He had never seen the Syracuse circuit, a terrifyingly fast 3.4-mile loop of public roads lined by stone walls, telegraph poles, and thousands of unprotected spectators. The Maserati drivers were already lapping at record speeds, their 250 Fs singing a high-pitched Italian aria. Brooks had no time to learn the car, and no time to learn the track. In a move that perfectly illustrated the amateur nature of the team, Brooks went out and hired a small Vespa scooter. For hours, the future legend of Formula One buzzed around the circuit on a two-stroke scooter, wearing his street clothes, memorizing the bumps in the tarmac and the shadows cast by the olive trees. He was a dental student on a moped, taking notes on a track where men died every year. The Maserati team watched him with amused contempt. They didn't even bother to time his laps. They were convinced that the green car wouldn't last 5 laps before the Alta engine disintegrated or the student put it into a stone wall. But as the sun rose on race day, the atmosphere in the paddock began to shift. In the final practice session, Brooks had quietly started to drop his lap times. He wasn't sliding the car or fighting the wheel. He was driving with a clinical, surgical precision. He was finding lines that the Italians had ignored. The racing dentist was beginning to find his rhythm. The conflict was no longer just about horsepower, it was a battle of philosophies. The Italians raced with passion, with flair, and with a win-or-die mentality. Brooks raced with the cold, detached logic of a scientist. Every gear change was calculated. Every braking zone was measured. He was treating the Syracuse Grand Prix like a complex surgical procedure. When the flag dropped, the sound was deafening. The Maseratis of Musso and Villaresi surged into the lead, their red noses carving through the heat haze. Brooks followed, his green Connaught tucked into their slipstream. The Tifosi cheered as Musso pulled away. They expected the Brit to fade, to succumb to the heat and the pressure. But as the race reached the 10-lap mark, Brooks was still there. He wasn't just following, he was closing. The Alta engine, the one everyone expected to blow apart, was holding together. The fuel injection was crisp. The aerodynamic bodywork of the Type B, which had been shaped in a wind tunnel, a rarity for the time, was allowing Brooks to keep pace with the more powerful Maseratis on the long, flat-out straights. Then the unthinkable happened. Brooks moved out of the slipstream and dove to the inside of Musso. The Italian champion tried to defend, but the Connaught's disc brakes, another British innovation, allowed Brooks to wait heart-stoppingly late before slowing for the corner. By the time they reached the apex, the green car was ahead. A stunned silence fell over the grandstands. For the first time in 31 years, a British car was leading a Grand Prix on the continent. The last time it had happened was in 1924, in an era of leather helmets and wooden wheels. The Maserati pit wall erupted in a frenzy. They signaled to Musso to push, to break the upstart student. The race turned into a high-speed duel. Musso would regain the lead on the straights, only for Brooks to snatch it back under braking. It was a 150-mile-per-hour game of chess. But Brooks had an advantage the Italians hadn't counted on. He had been studying his rivals. He noticed that the Maseratis were beginning to hunt under braking, their drum brakes fading in the Sicilian heat. His own disc brakes remained consistent. He also noticed that Musso was taking a wider, more aggressive line that was tearing his tires to shreds. Brooks stayed calm. He stayed precise. He ignored the heat and the roar of the crowd. He focused on the technical feedback from the Connaught's chassis. The worst was still ahead. As the race entered its final third, the Connaught's gearbox began to act up. The pre-selector system was slipping. Brooks had to hold the car in gear with one hand while steering with the other through the high-speed curves. It was a feat of physical and mental endurance that should have been impossible for a rookie. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Behind him, Musso was driving with a desperate, ragged fury. He was sliding the Maserati, clipping the stone walls, pouring every ounce of his talent into catching the green car. The gap fluctuated. 3 seconds, 2 seconds, then out to 4 again, as Brooks found another burst of speed. The tension in the Connaught pit was unbearable. Rodney Clark was staring at his stopwatch, his knuckles white. They had no spare parts. If the gearbox failed now, the team was finished. Not just the race, but the entire company. They had bet their last penny on this trip to Sicily. As the final lap began, the heat haze was so thick it looked like liquid. Brooks could feel the engine vibrating, the Alta 4-cylinder nearing its limit. He could see the dust kicked up by Musso's Maserati in his mirrors. He took the final corner, a tight, treacherous right-hander, and saw the checkered flag. Tony Brooks crossed the line to win the Syracuse Grand Prix. He hadn't just won, he had shattered the lap record. He had beaten the entire Works Maserati team by nearly a minute. The racing dentist had walked into the lion's den and walked out with the lion's mane. The reaction was one of total, paralyzed shock. The Italian newspapers the next morning didn't lead with politics or crime. They led with the invasion of the green cars. The win at Syracuse was seen as a national humiliation for Italy and a miracle for Britain. But here is the bitter irony that haunts the story of the Connaught Type B. If you look at the official Formula One record books, you won't find this win listed under the World Championship standings. In the 1950s, there were championship races and non-championship races. Syracuse was the latter. Because it didn't award points toward the title, the official history of the sport has quietly pushed this victory into the shadows. It is treated as a footnote, a minor race that doesn't count toward the grand tally of F1 history. But to the men who were there, and to the British racing industry, it counted for everything. The win at Syracuse changed the DNA of British motorsport. It proved that the garagists could win. It proved that British engineering, disc brakes, and scientific driving could topple the giants of Italy. The ripples of this victory were felt almost immediately. Tony van der Velde, who saw the Connaught win, was inspired to double his efforts with his Van Wall team, the team that would eventually win the first ever Constructors' Championship in 1958. Stirling Moss, who had been watching from the sidelines, realized that he didn't need to drive for an Italian team to be a world champion. The success of Connaught paved the way for Cooper, Lotus, and Brabham. It was the big bang for the British racing industry. Every British victory that followed, from the titles of Jim Clark to the dominance of Lewis Hamilton, can be traced back to that dusty afternoon in Sicily in 1955. But the Connaught team itself did not survive to see the revolution they started. Despite the glory of Syracuse, the money never materialized. The team remained chronically underfunded. They returned to England as heroes, but heroes who couldn't pay their rent. A year later, Rodney Clark was forced to sell off the cars at an auction to pay the team's debts. The Connaught Type B, the car that had humiliated Maserati, was sold to a private collector for a fraction of its value. Tony Brooks, however, became a superstar. He was snapped up by BRM, then Van Wall, and eventually Ferrari. He became one of the greatest drivers of all time, a man known for his incredible speed and his refusal to ever take an unnecessary risk. He won 6 World Championship Grand Prix and narrowly missed out on the world title in 1959. But even at the height of his fame, Brooks always maintained that the win at Syracuse was his greatest achievement. He had gone from a dental student on a scooter to a Grand Prix winner in the space of 72 hours. He had done it in a car that was built on a shoestring and powered by a prayer. The tragedy of the 1955 Connaught is that it is the forgotten victory. Because it wasn't a championship race, it isn't taught in the schools of racing history. It isn't featured in the glossy documentaries about the 1950s. It remains a secret, known only to the hardcore historians and the residents of Syracuse, who still remember the day the green car silenced the town. But we must remember it. We must remember the 23-year-old student who revised for his exams while crossing the Alps in a burning bus. We must remember the mechanics who worked in the dust of the roadside to keep a dream alive. We must remember the Alta engine that refused to die and the disc brakes that changed the world. The Connaught Type B wasn't just a car, it was a manifesto. It was a declaration that genius doesn't require a palace or a massive budget. It only requires a vision and the courage to take a moped around a circuit when everyone else is laughing at you. The media reaction in Britain at the time was a frantic, joyful disbelief. The BBC interrupted their programming to announce the result. It was seen as a moment of post-war British resurgence, a sign that the country that had survived the Blitz could still out-engineer the world. The Italian reaction was one of deep soul-searching. Enzo Ferrari was reportedly so unsettled by the Connaught win that he accelerated his own development of disc brakes and mid-engine designs. He realized that the English artisans were no longer just a nuisance. They were a threat to his very existence. As we look back on the legacy of 1955, we see a sport that was changed forever. The Syracuse Grand Prix was the end of the age of innocence for the Italian manufacturers. It was the moment they realized that prestige and history weren't enough to stop the relentless march of technological innovation. Today, the site of the Syracuse circuit is largely forgotten. The stone walls are still there, the olive trees still cast their long shadows, and the Sicilian sun still beats down on the limestone. There are no plaques to Tony Brooks, there are no monuments to the Connaught Type B. But if you stand at the edge of the old start-finish line and close your eyes, you can almost hear it. You can hear the high-pitched scream of the Maseratis, and beneath it, the steady, rhythmic thrum of a British four-cylinder engine. You can hear the silence of the crowd as the green car takes the lead. The win that never happened actually happened, and it was the most important win in the history of British racing. It was the day the underdogs didn't just win, they rewrote the rules of the game. Tony Brooks eventually finished his dental studies. He became a successful businessman and lived a long, quiet life, always modest about his achievements. He passed away in 2022, the last surviving Grand Prix winner from the 1950s. But he left behind a story that serves as a permanent reminder to every aspiring engineer and driver. It doesn't matter how small your garage is. It doesn't matter if your bus is on fire. It doesn't matter if the establishment laughs at you. If you have the right car, the right mind, and the courage to push a scooter around the track at night, you can beat the world. The Connaught Type B was the first British car to win a Formula One race. It was a tragedy, a triumph, and a revolution. And even if the record books try to pretend it didn't happen, the ghosts of Syracuse know the truth. The British arrived in a battered bus, and they left as kings. Formula One history didn't start with the giants. It started with a dental student in a blue polo shirt who refused to be intimidated by the scarlet cars of Italy. And that is a story that should never be forgotten.